Hey guys, what is up? So my name is Robert Jordan Carrillo Zarita, but you can just call me Jordan for short. I'm 21 years old and I'm a fourth year biology student. And today I'm going to go over what it's like to be a thesis student working in a food and soft materials lab.
Right, and so my project is titled Evaluation of the Effects of Moisture on Molten Chocolate Rheology. So it's done by myself under the supervision of Dr. Rousseau as part of the Food and Soft Materials group here at Ryerson. And so just to start us off, I'm going to go over, well, what molten chocolate is. Well, essentially, molten chocolate is just a dispersion of cocoa particles, sugar particles, as well as emulsifier within a continuous phase of cocoa butter. Now, I don't know if you've ever melted chocolate before, but if you have, then you can see that it is quite viscous, right? And so you do need to put in a little bit of force to get that chocolate moving. You can do it with a fork, you can do it just by shaking something. And so it is quite viscous in this molten state. And part of that, what this means really is that it is a non-Newtonian liquid in that it is quite viscous, but to get it to initially flow, you do need to input that little bit of force or a little bit of action so that it starts to flow. And so the reason this occurs is because at the macrostructural level, as you can sort of see here, you have all these different particles within the cocoa butter that are going to interact, move past one another, slide, glide, et cetera, et cetera. And what this is doing is it's causing friction between everything. And so because of this, the actual continuous phase cannot flow by all that well versus if it was unrestricted and didn't have any of these particles within its makeup. And so because of this, it is why it's so viscous. And so when you're looking at it from a rheological standpoint, rheology being the study of the formation of materials, it really is the interaction between these particles which are going to govern the different rheological properties, such as the viscosity, as well as other important ones that I'll talk about later on. And so in industry, chocolatiers often desire to have a product of low viscosity. And the reason being is from a practical point of view, you have to think about chocolate being produced in different unit processes. And so the chocolatiers are going to want to have to transport it from one stage to another stage. And often this is done with pipes. Now, you want to have this system be as efficient as possible. And if you have a really thick liquid, you're going to have to input a lot of force to get that to go from one place to another. And so, from an economic standpoint, that's not so viable. And so, typically, you'd want something more viscous, something that can flow much easier to facilitate that transfer. Now, part of this is means you have to optimize a specific rheological parameter of chocolate, which is known as the yield value. And the yield value is that initial little bit of force that you need to input into the fluid so that it can start to flow. And so you can imagine if you have a ketchup and you want to get it out of the container, you have to hit the container a little bit or shake it so that the ketchup actually can start to pour onto your food. And so that's that force that you need to move the ketchup is the yield value. And chocolate has one, a yield value very similar to that of ketchup in that they both have that property. And so to achieve an ideal viscosity and to achieve an ideal yield value, one that facilitates the movement of chocolate from one unit process to another, you can achieve it in one of a few ways. One way you can achieve this is by adding in an emulsifier. And so as I mentioned earlier in this slide, an emulsifier can be present in the formulation of chocolate. And this sort of acts as a spacer between all the individual particles at the microstructural level. And essentially what they do is they create, the emulsifier themselves are amphiphilic. So they have a component that likes polar substances and one that doesn't like polar substances. It's apolar in that sense. And so what happens is the polar part will bind to everything that's polar in the chocolate, in this case, something like sugar, and the apolar part or the tails will flail out into the cocoa butter phase. And so now you have these different components which like each other differently, being separated from each other and creating just a much better interface, overall less friction, and as a result, a much more flowy chocolate. So that's one way we can go about it. And typically in the chocolate industry, we can add something like lecithin, which is very common. I'm sure if you read the back of a package of chocolate, you might see that it has soy lecithin in its makeup. And so before that chocolate might have been solid, the soy lecithin essentially had that function to facilitate the flow. But another way we can also go about this is also altering the size of particles we have in our chocolate. And the reason, specifically, we can look something towards altering the sugar particle sizes. And that's because if you have these larger particles, then there's less interactions going on, there's less contact points. However, you'll have a much more grittier chocolate. And so you can supplement this by having smaller particles, which sort of, again, act as spacers between the larger ones, so that everything flows better, and it eliminates that grittiness that would be offered by just using a single larger particle size. And so the dilemma here in industry is that sometimes we can have water get into chocolate. And so if you've ever added water to chocolate, what you'll see is that, for starters, it starts off as something that can easily flow. It has a nice shine, and you can see that here the chocolate's just pouring down the whisk. And so here, this is water-free chocolate. And the reason why it behaves and looks like this is because if you're just looking at this diagram right here, all the sugar particles are able to flow past one another, and the cocoa butter itself is also able to flow past the individual particles. So there's not so much friction going on. There's as much of that lubricating cocoa butter as possible, and so everything can just sort of flow. Now, when you add water to the system, what essentially occurs is that the sugar really loves the water. And so the water binds to the sugar and it starts to solubilize it and kind of create a sticky coating on its surface. And what this sticking coating does is it attracts other sugar particles and it causes them to aggregate together. And this aggregation process now creates these particle aggregates, which behave much larger than they really are, and they increase the internal friction of the system itself. And as a result, everything has a much harder time flowing past one another. And so overall, the overall chocolate will be much more viscous. Not only that, but there's also going to be less available of that continuous cocoa butter phase, and that's because sometimes when we have aggregation, the aggregates themselves can capture some of that free flowing cocoa butter, and so there's less lubricant, and as a result, everything just doesn't move as well. Now, it's not currently known, for example, how much moisture really is needed to have a notable effect on chocolate, where essentially it goes from what is this free flowing material to now this chocolate paste. It's almost like an icing or like a really thick ganache. Now, it's not exactly known how much moisture is needed to go from one point to the other. And it's not necessarily known specifically if we have that emulsifier lecithin, which sort of seeks to counteract that high friction effect. It's also not really known, which components themselves are most affected. Is it the sugar? Is it the emulsifier? Is it cocoa butter? Is it cocoa particles? And so this is essentially what my project seeks to understand. It aims to investigate what the effects of moisture are on molten chocolate viscosity when this lecithin sort of emulsifier spacer is available. Okay, and so the goals for my project are first and foremost to determine the critical moisture value that will see the chocolate transform from this more free-flowing fluid to this more paste-like material. I also want to determine the rheological behavior of chocolate when you add water. And so here I want to look at, the viscosity as water is added and different amounts of water are added. And I also want to look at other important rheological parameters, which again, the study deformation of materials, so that I can better understand the role that water has on governing essentially chocolate and how it flows. And then finally, I also want to observe and understand the microstructure of chocolate because again, I want to see, what components are affected by water. And I also want to understand, to another point, what types of interactions are occurring between the different constituents, because there are several different kinds of forces that are governed in this system that will determine the stability of chocolate, how it behaves in terms of deformation, viscosity, and stuff like that. And so just continuing on, my methods to get this accomplished are going to be, first of all, to create my systems. Now, working with chocolate can be a little bit tedious. You have to heat it up, and it is a little bit more complex just because of the inherent complexity of cocoa particles. And so much like how in biology and in medical sciences, you can sort of deduce ideas or understandings about human diseases from mouse models, in food science and in material science, you can really understand the way chocolate works simply through model systems of sugar dispersions. And so that's what I'm going to be working with. So they're going to be made up of purified canola oil, confectioner's sugar, as well as different amounts of added water. So it's going to be 0% added water, 0.1, 0.3, 0.5, 0.7, and then 0.9% water. Plus, we're also going to add either 0% of our emulsifier or 1% of our emulsifier so that we can determine what effect does the emulsifier have, in this case lecithin, if it's present or not. The second component now is going to be to observe the microstructure of my samples. And so I'm going to take my series of samples, there should be 6, and then I'm going to put them on microscope slides and then observe them using an inverted microscope, which itself has many different capabilities. It has the ability to look at things in bright field, which is just your traditional microscopy. It has a technique that you can do known as polarized light microscopy. And so here, anything that can sort of light up will light up. For example, sugar can light up during this microscopy process. And then finally, I'm also going to look at it in through fluorescence microscopy. And so to look at it through fluorescence microscopy, I have to add a fluorescent dye to my systems. And so that's why, as you can see here, they have the 6 systems have different colors. And so that's because we can add a reddish orangish dye, which will light up. It'll mix with the water and it'll light up depending on where that dye water solution actually ends up in the sample. Third, I'm going to obtain my rheological data. So I'm going to run my samples through the rheometer, which is a device that's used to study the sort of material-like properties of some of our fluids and the deformation of materials. And so this will allow us to develop the necessary curves and information that we want, or that I want rather, so that I can complete my project. And so here I can develop a viscosity curve, which will tell me, as we spin, because the way it works essentially is that there's a little bob which goes into a cup that has our sample, and it spins, and it basically, as it spins, it measures the amount of force that is being applied or given into the system so that the material itself can spin with it. So from here we can develop a viscosity curve, which tells us how the viscosity increases or decreases as we increase the rate at which we have the bob spinning. We can look at our flow curves, which basically looks to determine, what is the stress or the force needed to move our material as we increase that spinning. And we can also transform all this data to a model, in this case, the Casson model, which is typically used in the confectionery industry, so that we can develop important parameters such as our viscosity as well as our yield value. And then finally, I want to observe sedimentation. And so this is just part of observing and understanding the microstructure. What sedimentation tells us basically is what are the different forces going on within the system? Is one thing working like this or one thing working like that, based on how fast or to what level our suspensions actually separate into 2 different components, that being our oil phase of canola oil and then the particulate phase being our sugar, as well as anything else that may be dispersed in there. And for the most part, that is my project. Okay, and so now I'm just going to go through the process of preparing my samples so I can image them. And so here, one of the products that I need is going to be some confectionery sugar, as well as some canola oil. So this was just simply purchased from the store. I also have some lecithin, which is an emulsifier, so that I can add that to my samples. And of course, because I'm investigating the effects of water, I'm also going to use a little bit of water so that I can formulate my samples. Now, store-bought canola oil contains a lot of contaminants, and so I'm going to want to purify that, and boom, I have my purified canola oil, which I did in a separate process. And to be able to image my samples and essentially see where the water is going, I'm going to use a fluorescein solution, which is essentially just water and dye, which will allow me to see them in the microscope. And so now begins the process of mixing everything together. So here I am just getting a clean beaker. I think this is a 150 milliliter beaker, but really I just need a beaker enough to hold my contents. And so alongside the beaker, I'm also going to need a clean stir bar, which is basically going to work to mix everything together once all our products are in the beaker. And so now that I have my stir bar and my beaker, I can now begin to essentially weigh out all of my individual constituents. So here I just grabbed a little bit of that purified oil. Basically, even that's too much, more than I'm going to need, but I'm just going to bring it to my to the analytical balance. And then I'm going to use a sterilized syringe so that I can accurately, or at least somewhat accurately, add the oil to my sample. So here I'm just drawing up some of that purified oil, making sure there's no air bubbles, and then making sure there's nothing dripping off the side because I don't want to dirty my space. And then I'm just going to add it into the sample slowly because I don't want to create any unnecessary air. And so once I have enough oil to make a sample that contains 70% oil, I can begin to add my sugar. And so this is just the confectionery sugar, which I sealed tightly in a container. Now I opened it, and basically I'm just going to try and grab some sugar. Oh, make sure nothing falls. And then just slowly add it so that my sample will actually get up to 20 grams. Because if I'm making a 70 oil, 30 sugar sample, then that roughly equates to it. So there we go. We have our 20 grams of sugar and oil. And then finally now we can start to take this and get it all mixed up. And so here I'm basically walking down the lab towards the area where we contain all the stir plates or hot plates. And so I'm just going to set it down. I'm then going to turn it on and basically set the appropriate RPM that I want to mix my sample at. And here I also labeled the beaker. And so basically what this does is there's a magnet in the plate and the stir bar will mix. So then once everything is all mixed, I think after 30 minutes, I can safely take it off and then begin to add my water. So here I'm adding my water. There's my little solution. So I'm just going to open it and be extra careful because this solution can stain, and that's the last thing you want to do, stain all the labware with something that could potentially not come off. And so I'm going to slowly add enough water, and I think here I added 0.9% water, so compared to the overall sample. And then once the water is added, I can essentially go back to that same stir plate and then put the sample to mix one more time. And then finally, after roughly 45 minutes, the sample is all mixed up. And as you can see, it turned bright orange because the fluorescent dye water solution mixed it nicely. And now finally, it's time to put it on a microscope slide so that I can image it. So this is just a clean, sterilized microscope slide. I don't want to be too dirty. I'm also going to grab my microscope cover slip so that I can just place over my sample. And so now I'm just going to take my diluted sample and I'm going to try my best to grab a little drop and essentially place it on a microscope slide. And oh, there we go. So I'd just like to note that I'm essentially going to repeat this process about 6 different times because my samples, in my series of samples, there's 6 according to either the addition of 0, 0.1, 0.3, 0.5, 0.7, or 0.7% water. So finally, once the sample's on the slide, I can just cover it up and now it's ready to be imaged. And you see here, there we go. We have a perfectly made slide. So this is the microscope room. As you can see here, it's got a computer, it's got the microscope, it has some chairs, and so here's my hypothetical 6 samples, which I'm just going to take. I labeled them, and I'm just going to place them down onto the microscope itself. So this is actually an inverted microscope, so you might see in the lab how we have the ones that the lens is actually over top. Well, here it's at the bottom. So it's connected to a camera, which in turn is connected to the computer, and it'll allow me to see my samples. And so this is what one of my samples looks like, and you can see the sugar is aggregating. And I'll just here adjust the focus, and then once I feel like the focus is good enough, I can snap a picture of it, and then I can move on from looking at it in light microscopy now to fluorescence microscopy. And so this is where the dye comes in, because the dye is going to bind to the sugar, and under fluorescent light, the dye is going to emit a signal. And so I can play around, and that's what I'm doing here. I can play around with the exposure so that I can get that beautiful bright light image from the samples. So once it's all done, I can also view it in a different type of microscopy. And so here I'm setting that up, and this is known as polarized light microscopy. And so I'm just making sure everything's in place. And now what this essentially does is it shines polarized light onto the sample, and essentially under polarized light, sugar tends to light up. And so that's why it kind of looks like stars in the sky. And so this is more or less to confirm that it is in fact my sugar, which is aggregating. And so I have to repeat this several times, I believe 6 times in theory. But the way I did it was I tracked my samples over a month. So each week I would come in, view them, and then basically see if there's any differences from one day to another. And I repeated this for my second set of samples as well. Now the lab is awesome because sometimes you can come really early in the morning, so this is 7 a.m., but then sometimes you might end up leaving super late.
Alright guys, and so when I'm not on campus doing my thesis work, I'm actually juggling my other courses as well. So part of the thesis student experience is that, aside from doing your thesis work and being in a thesis course, you're also enrolled in your other courses for your 4th or 5th year. Now 2020, 2021 is a little bit different in terms of school years in that it was online, unfortunately, to the pandemic. And so everyone probably had their own different setup and ways to go about studying and handling this sort of Zoom school. So I'm just going to get into the details of how I handled it, what exactly my setup was, and just kind of detailing what I felt made me the most efficient student that I could have been given the circumstances. And so we're just going to dive into that right now.
All right, and so this is the chair that I use in my setup. Now, you don't necessarily need a gaming chair, but I will say that it is very important that you find yourself a chair which is ergonomic and comfortable to sit in, because you may find yourself at your desk for extended periods of time. Now, this one does spin, which is useful for moving around. It does have lumbar support as well as a neck pillow. And now, this is my computer here, and so I have a MacBook, but really you don't necessarily need a MacBook. However, I would say that it is wise that you get a decently powerful computer, just because sometimes you may find that you're going to have multiple tabs open on Chrome, you're going to have multiple different apps open as well, and so it's really good to have a computer that can handle all the input you're going to give into it during your time in undergraduate. And so to accompany my laptop, I also have a second monitor here. Now, you don't need anything too crazy or too expensive. You just need something that gets the job done, but you do not understand how efficient you will be in having two different screens to look at things. You can essentially do notes on one while looking at videos on another, or write an assignment on one while looking for stuff on another web browser. It's crazy how efficient you can be in the work with two monitors. Now, I do also have a small lamp as part of my setup so that I can brighten up my workspace, but also I can have some light in the late hours when I don't want to disturb anyone. Now, it's also very helpful to have a USB on you at all times, especially if you're a thesis student and you might want to get results from the lab and bring it home. You don't want to lug around your computer, you can just bring in a USB and put everything on that. Now, I also like to keep eye drops handy at all times, because you are looking at your computer maybe more times than you'd want to, and so it is just very good to keep your eyes refreshed. Now, I also have a few different headphone options handy at all times, though personally I find the wired ones are better for something like Zoom school, because you have to worry about charging them, and so they're always handy when you need it.
Now, I also got my whiteboard going on here, and so this is just a really helpful tool to have at your desk. It's kind of like having large sticky notes, which I also keep just some small sticky notes right there for small little work, like annotating books, for example. But having this large whiteboard is really super helpful. It has some magnets, some erasers, and stuff like that. But basically, it allows me to write the date, make sure I'm aware of time. Just write down random notes, really, of stuff I have on the side, maybe some personal things I have to do in my life, as well as basically keep up with my assignments, for example. And so something like this, incredibly helpful. You'd say you're doing schoolwork, you have a thought come to mind, you don't have anywhere to write it down. You can just grab a marker and just sort of just write away, and boom, you have all your sort of random thoughts and stuff right in front of you. It's really great.
And so this is what I mean when I say that having two screens is amazing. So as you can see here, I'm on OneNote and I'm just taking notes while I'm following through class on my other screen. And so this is awesome because I can have the instructor here presenting, going through the lecture, and then over here I can just immediately follow along with the slides and just type away at exactly what she's saying. And I have this essentially all centralized in one location so that I can go later on and start to make my own notes. And so for my note-taking process, essentially, I do just follow along with what the professor is doing. So the professor will be lecturing, they'll be abbreviating on the slides that are on screen, and then what I'll be doing is I'll just type away at exactly what the professor is saying, because usually they will abbreviate on what is on the slides, often stuff that's not on the slides itself. So I try to gather as much information as possible. So when I'm done with the lecture, what I like to do is I like to transfer over the notes over into Word. And so I like to keep these templates preset so that I can just fill in the according course code, week that I'm in, and the content for that week, so that I can just start copying and pasting everything into a Word document. And then from here, I do essentially just copy my notes over from OneNote over into Microsoft Word, but this is the perfect opportunity to include your other notes, maybe from the textbook or from supplemental readings, into your main notes as well, so that you just have one compiled document of all the course content for that specific week on this specific subject. Now here you can also add, for example, any diagrams or any pictures that are also from the notes or from the textbook, so that you can supplement your notes that are more wordy with some more diagrams and schematics that can maybe make better sense of the topic and its content. And so by the time you're all done, you'll essentially have one large document which is going to have all of your notes for a specific week or a specific subject, and it'll just really help you when it comes to studying because you have all your notes in a central location. Now, what I like to do when I'm done with my notes is I like to print a physical copy. And the reason why I like to print a physical copy is just because of the way that I personally like to study. And so when my notes are done, what I like to do is I actually like to annotate my notes. And so the reason why I like to annotate my notes is because it means I have to read over my notes one to catch any mistakes, but also it allows me to annotate with my own writing. And I can draw arrows and connect different concepts together. I can begin to abbreviate on other concepts, maybe write little analogies and stuff like that, so that I can just make the whole studying process easier. Now, part of this, what I like to do as well, is put little sticky notes on my sheet so that I can sort of make reference to specific sections or concepts so that I can refer to them later on should I need to. And so after I'm done annotating all my notes and stuff, they will look like this. They'll have all these colorful sticky notes flying off the side. So when my notes are done, the way that I utilize them is I sort of use them as a pamphlet to lecture myself, or rather lecture the open air while I walk around in an open space. And so this is how I've been studying for pretty much 4 years. I just find that lecturing to myself or lecturing to the open air allows me to speak and recall concepts from memory, and eventually I can start to put them in my own words, sort of connect things together, and essentially just become more informed in the topic that I'm looking at.
All right, so those were just some tips basically on how I like to study, both for theory-based courses as well as for more machine learning type courses like math or maybe a chemistry course, for example. But now just for some general sort of studying tips, one thing I like to recommend is, always keep a water bottle on you. It's very good to stay hydrated, and your body will thank yourself later. Another thing is also, when you're studying, try not to dress so comfortable. Wear something that you would wear to school or wear something that you would wear to work. Basically, just don't study in your loungewear. If you study, for example, like I'm wearing track pants and like a t-shirt and a flannel top, whatever, wearing something like that will basically gives you the feeling that you're not at home, that you're somewhere else doing something active, and so it really sort of puts you in that mindset to just go out there and go study.
And so something else I wanted to mention was that it's very important to be organized. So what I like to do is I have this rack where I just store all my printables, and as you can see here, I have each shelf labeled with a different course. And so it allows me to, again, keep a centralized location now for all of my papers, so that later on, if I'm looking for something, I know in what shelf it will be, as again, just to make the whole studying process more efficient.
Okay, and so when I'm not doing schoolwork and I'm not in the lab doing my thesis project, I like to do a whole lot of things in my spare time, and I actually try to work as efficiently as possible so I can offer myself more breaks so that I can just, refresh my mind, keep myself refreshed in general so that when the next assignment comes in or the next study period comes in, I'm refreshed and I'm just ready to go and dive in.
And so during my free time, the way I like to relax is just to sit down and watch something that interests me. One thing that I really love to watch is sports, specifically soccer, which is what I'm watching here. And so here, I'm just watching my favorite team, Manchester United, catching up on a game, and just refreshing my mind, watching something that I can really get into. Now, when I'm not watching soccer, the other sport that I love to watch is basketball. And so basketball games, as you know, they happen later on in the night, which is great because I can just play them in the background while I'm taking notes. But basketball is awesome, and it's just again another sport to really get into. I love the Toronto Raptors. Now it's a shame that they're not doing that well this season, but as you can see here, when they're hitting clutch shots, it's such a great feeling to just watch them excel. And so continuing along the lines of watching things on my free time, I also like to sit down with a nice cup of tea or a nice cup of coffee and just watch some television, whether it's on Netflix or Prime Video or Disney Plus. I just really enjoy sitting down and maybe catching up on some old series I used to love or keeping up to date with the latest series. I think here I'm watching Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which, by the way, very good. Would 100% recommend to watch. And so that's kind of what I find myself just doing, sitting down, getting comfy, and watching some quality television. And so, given all the sitting that I find myself doing both in my free time as well as during school, when the weather's nice, I love to go for runs in my neighborhood park and just really breathe in the fresh air and just take care of my body.
All right, and so that's pretty much what it's like to be a thesis student in the biology program who happens to be doing work in a food and soft materials lab. Now, just some last minute tips before I sign off. I want to stress the importance of taking breaks and just really taking care of yourself, both your physical health as well as your mental health. It's I want to stress it's also very good to get proper sleep. Nothing too crazy, but maybe a proper 7-8 hours. You'll thank yourself during the day when you have as much energy as possible to just blow up, to just go through it basically. And on a final note, I want to stress the importance of being organized and really staying on top of everything. And so you saw that I like to use my whiteboard, for example, but even something like a planner is very good to have, where you just write down your due dates, when you have this and that, and it just keeps everything organized. It makes you most efficient, and it'll just do wonders for you and your experience in university. And so thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope that I was really helpful. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me on my socials. So bye.